This episode of Doing the Most is sponsored by Olive Nation. More about our partnership with them in just a bit. On this episode of Doing the Most, a recipe that has taken us many months and many tries to get just right. And we are finally ready to present to you our recipe for home-brewed butter beer.
Homemade brews and various R2s, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
This recipe took basically forever to get right, and it started off in a completely different direction than what it ended up. And sometimes developing a recipe is like that. And it was before the holidays when we started on this. I actually still have some bottles down here under the workbench that are from the original batch. And that original batch turned out great. David came over and tasted it one night and said that this is perfect. Why aren't you still doing it this way? And the problem was it wasn't repeatable. We tried and tried to make that first batch happen again and again until we finally just gave up. The original recipe used sweetened condensed milk, and I know what you're thinking, and you're right. It turned out really kind of disgusting. Now, the very initial batch turned out great, but every subsequent batch had way too much of that pungent lactic acid flavor to be enjoyable. And another problem with that was there were so many milk solids in there that the yield was actually like 3 gallons in a 5-gallon batch. So also not super ideal. What we did is we took sweetened condensed milk and converted that in a pressure cooker to become dulce de leche. And while this turned out to make a really interesting product and a really interesting brew that had a lot of the smells and flavors that you would associate with a butter beer, on the other end of things, like I said, it was just too sour. No amount of sweetness really seemed to cut through the sourness in a way that was pleasant on the palate in a carbonated drink. So we threw out the idea of using sweetened condensed milk, even though I thought it would be super cool YouTube content. So you just get to see some clips of it here. And instead, we decided to drill down on what the sugar makeup of sweetened condensed milk was in the quantity that we were using it, and then use those sugars in a bochet process. So let's take a look at our recipe. The ingredients for our butter beer bochet are 5 pounds of honey, 1 pound of sucrose, 4 ounces of lactose, 1 pound of dark Belgian candy sugar, 3 grams of wine tannin, and a full 5 gallons of water. Our yeast will be D47 or EC1118. In secondary, we will be adding 5 vanilla beans or 2 tablespoons of vanilla extract, 8 ounces of lactose, 8 ounces of maltodextrin, 5 grams of lactic acid, 1 gram of citric acid, and either 3 pounds of erythritol or honey to back sweeten, depending on how you're going to carbonate this. And this needs to be heavily carbonated. So as you can see, there are a variety of different sugars here, and they're used in a few different ways to achieve the final flavor profile that we were going for. And each of these sugars contributes something different to the brew. There's bochet honey in there that gives some rich caramel and toffee notes. And there's Belgian candy sugar in there, which kind of hefts up the buttery, butterscotchy flavor. Additionally, we've got lactose to add some creaminess, in addition to some maltodextrin that is there to provide some richness and thickness that this brew needs in order to carry that flavor all throughout the palate. And then of course, we have our back sweetening sugars, erythritol, which can provide a nice sweetness for a bottle conditioned version of this, but honey is really where the flavor shines in back sweetening. We prefer to back sweeten with honey and throw that in a keg to carbonate. Now, some of these sugars are fermentable, some of them are non-fermentable, and all the different ways we use them, all the different ways they work together really amplify that butterscotchy but crisp and refreshing and delicate flavor profile. This isn't a commercial butter beer that's thick and chewy and sweet and cloying. This is a refreshing carbonated hard soda in the form of a bochet. All right, let's get started making butterbeer. First thing we're gonna do is throw a Dutch oven on the stove and crank that heat up to medium high. Then we're adding in our honey. Here I'm using raspberry blossom honey because it's what I had on hand, but I would recommend using wildflower or clover honey for this. Make sure to get every last drop in there. And then we're adding our sucrose and our lactose. And we're just gonna get that caramelizing, just a typical bochet process. And we're gonna simmer that for a minimum of 40 minutes, but you could go all the way up to 1 hour. After your timer goes off, go ahead and cut that heat, and it will be noticeably darker. And then we're gonna add our Belgian candy sugar. You may not have used Belgian candy sugar before in brewing, particularly if you've never brewed a Belgian style beer like a triple or a double. Belgian candy sugar typically comes from beet sugar, and it goes through a Maillard and caramelization process in order to create a very unique kind of brewing sugar. We added it in here after all of our caramelization had already happened because there's no reason to add additional process to the Belgian candy sugar when it goes in. However, we wanted to get it all nice and melted down. We topped that up with some water after the Belgian candy sugar went in, and then just stirred and stirred until everything had melted and dissolved. And then we let that cool for a couple of hours. Once that had cooled, we went ahead and added our water to our fermentation bucket, and then dumped in all of those caramelized sugars. Now I know what you may be thinking, but yes, we did use tap water here because I didn't want to wait for our refrigerator filtration system to filter 5 gallons of water. And that was fine because the flavor profile in this is so strong that a little bit of mineraliness in my tap water, not really a problem in this brew. However, for a more consistent butterbeer, you might want to use bottled spring water or filtered water. On top of that, we're tossing in our wine tannin, and this just helps carry the flavor around the palate with a nice, delicate tannin profile. Without this, even with all those thickening sugars in there, this can still feel a little bit flat. Stir, 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 getting everything incorporated, and then we'll get a gravity reading with our hydrometer so we can estimate our alcohol by volume. This here was right around 1.049. We're using D47 yeast here for a nice low temperature and clean fermentation, and sprinkling that right on top. Get everything labeled, and then we're gonna throw on a paper towel with an upturned coffee mug so it can breathe a little bit during the first few days of fermentation. For this butterbeer recipe, it's recommended to do a staggered nutrient addition schedule. That basically means you're starting at the 24-hour mark and adding a small dose of nutrient every day for the first few days. I'm going to put a link in the description for more information on staggered nutrient schedules. I like Tosna 2.0 because I'm a little bit of a lazy brewer and it's really easy to calculate and really easy to make those nutrient additions. This gives you a nice clean ferment with no off flavors or stinky aromas, and it helps everything go really smoothly, so you should have a nice clean ferment in about 1 to 2 weeks. This should finish primary fermentation with a hydrometer reading very near to 1.000. But due to the suspended non-fermentable sweeteners in here, it would not be unusual for this to stop fermentation at 1.005 all the way up to 1.010. Just make sure to take consistent hydrometer readings to make sure you know fermentation has completed before you move on to secondary. In our secondary vessel, we're going to be adding the lactose and maltodextrin. This is going to help thicken everything up and give it that nice butterscotchy chew. And then we're going to add some vanilla. So here in secondary, we used vanilla beans for this process, but I can also recommend using vanilla extract. And here's the deal, you want a good vanilla extract. The first couple batches that I tried this on, rather than risking vanilla beans, I used homemade vanilla extract. That's our vanilla extract. You may have seen the video. We typically make that with vodka or with bourbon, and it's a really nice vanilla extract. But our friends over at Olive Nation sent over some of their vanilla extract as well as some of their vanilla beans for us to try in this recipe. And I can confirm that their vanilla extract is really, really good. And it's honestly, it's got more of a rich, complex vanilla flavor than the stuff we're making at home. But you know, the stuff we're making at home is usually for making cookies, pies, things like that. This stuff is really great for brewing. So if you want to use vanilla extract and save a little money instead of using vanilla beans, I can recommend Olive Nation's vanilla extract. So check it out. There'll be a link to purchase their products in the description of this video, and I can confirm that both their vanilla beans and their vanilla extracts are great for brewing purposes. The bottle conditioned version that I'm going to pour here in a little bit was made with Olive Nation's vanilla extract. So big shout out to Olive Nation for being a friend and supporter of the channel, and I'm very excited. They sent me a couple of big boxes of stuff to try out in homebrewing, and so I'm really thrilled to see how those products work in other brews. The reason we're adding vanilla is because it's kind of a core flavor component to dulce de leche, but it's also a really nice flavor enhancer for butterscotchy flavors. So the vanilla is not just crucial, but it's actually necessary to make this recipe really sing. Vanilla beans go right in. And I was going to be kegging my batch, so I went ahead and stabilized because I could not ensure that my keg was actually going to stay super cold to help prevent re-fermentation. So I used potassium metabisulfite and potassium sorbate to stabilize this butter beer. But if you were going to be bottle conditioning, you would want to skip that step. You don't want your brew to be stabilized if you're going to be bottle conditioning because you need active healthy yeast to create carbonation in the bottles. So I racked on top of all that stuff and stirred it up nice and gently, and then I put that away for exactly 3 weeks. At 3 weeks in secondary, it's time to get it off those vanilla beans so we don't get too much vanilla flavor and get it back sweetened. Here, because I was kegging, I added honey, but if you're going to be bottle conditioning, this is where you would add your erythritol to back sweeten. So as you may recall, we started this process by using caramelized sweetened condensed milk to get a butterscotch flavor in the brew. And part of what worked about that was the fact that it had lactic acid in it, which is a tart but also buttery and smooth kind of acid. The benefit of brewing this with the sugars that we did in the way we did allows us to control the acidity on the back end. So that's why we used a little touch of citric acid for just a little pop of brightness, and also lactic acid to give some tartness and some round, smooth creaminess to the acid profile. And this is just a small amount of acid, just a very small amount seems to do the trick pretty well. And what I love about it is you don't have that buttery diacetyl that can kind of oil slick your mouth. And of course you don't have any fats or oils or solids to deal with like we had when we were brewing with the sweetened condensed milk. I feel that using the lactic acid to tweak the dial just a little bit at the end is what really amplifies the flavor from being just a nice rich caramel toffee drink to a butterscotchy butter beer beverage. Butterscotchy butter beer beverage, butterscotchy butter beer beverage, butterscotchy butter beer beverage. That's hard to do. The lactic acid that's available in the market for homebrewing is 88% suspension, so I weighed that out as 5 grams because I'm used to weighing out my acids in grams, and that just made it easier for me mentally to do this math. So I used a pipette to put exactly 5 grams of this lactic acid solution on my scale. And then I tared my scale and added 1 gram of citric acid. Stir, stir, stir. That is going to go directly into our carboy, and then we're going to allow this to clear up for a few weeks before we put it in the keg. And then after the rest of the solids have dropped out of there, it's time to get it siphoned into a keg. I put this under 40 psi for 4 days, and I shook it for 30 minutes every single day to make sure that plenty of CO2 was able to dissolve into suspension. Now this butter beer really needs to be carbonated, and I'm talking heavily carbonated, like 4 volumes or higher of CO2. So make sure to use a priming sugar calculator if bottle conditioning, because I tried using carbonation drops and some other kind of corner cutting measures, and it wasn't enough carbonation to really carry this flavor forward. So just make sure not to over-carbonate your bottles, and make sure to put them in the fridge before you open them so you don't get a gusher. If bottle conditioning instead of kegging, please use a priming sugar calculator. I can't stress that enough. And also make sure that your priming sugar is mixed throughout the batch before you bottle it. Please don't create bottle bombs. Nobody likes bottle bombs. And one final note on bottle conditioning, if it's dropped relatively clear, you might consider rehydrating some EC1118 yeast in a little bit of water and put that into your bottling bucket whenever you're bottling, just to make sure you have some healthy yeast mixed into suspension. I found that adding champagne yeast at bottling gave me a consistent and quicker bottle condition than just relying on the yeast still suspended in the brew. And I know there is a lot of explaining and over-explaining in this video, but this is the most tested recipe we have done on the channel, and I'm really excited to share it with you. All right, let's do it. So, like a hard soda, this doesn't really hold a lot of head, but of course has lots and lots of carbonation, which is exactly what you want. This one, bottle conditioned, back sweetened with erythritol. This one, kegged, back sweetened with honey. I think the color pretty much looks the same, but let's check out the flavor profile. So good. So it's rich, it's smooth, it's sweet. The erythritol does exactly what it needs to do, really amplifies that sweetness. And man, that lactic acid is there just in that way where you can just notice it. And it really gives that butterscotch flavor in just such a wonderful, just excellent way. And now my preferred, the kegged version. The honey just adds just a little bit more nuance. But both of them taste relatively the same. I think it would be difficult in an A/B test to pick apart which one is which. Maybe it's psychological, but I feel like I really prefer the honey flavor in this. It's just so rich and excellent. The carbonation helps make it kind of light and airy, while also adding just a slight element of crispness to it. This is not cloyingly sweet. This doesn't gum up your mouth with the sugars or anything like that. It's refreshing and in kind of that way like a cream soda, a really nice ice cold cream soda is on a hot summer day. Like it's not overly sweet in a way that makes you think, I gotta stop at one. You really could have a couple of these and not even really feel overwhelmed by that sweetness on your palate. Initially, you're hit with honey and a little bit of sweetness on the front. And then in the mid palate, you get those caramel, toffee, and a little bit burnt honey kind of notes from that bochet process. As you exhale, you get additional sweetness, but that pop of buttery richness and just a touch of acid. Some folks might actually want more citric acid in here than that little tiny amount that we added. But for my palate, I think this is actually perfect. It tastes like butterscotch, it drinks like a hard soda, you don't pick up any of the alcohol at all, and in like real not bougie things, I've been drinking this over ice lately because it's freaking hot here. It's been in the 90s Fahrenheit here in Oklahoma. And over ice, this thing drinks just like a soda. I'm telling you, this is weirdly one of the most refreshing things I've made. And y'all know I'm all about session meads and hoppy beers and Skeeter Pea. But this butter beer, I really feel like, despite it being a very long process and a lot of frustration, I think nails this as a brewed alcoholic beverage. Butterbeer. My gift to all of you, go brew it. Tell me what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy the recipe. It has been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on our part, but I think it's really, really, really nice. Please follow us on social media. All the links will be up here. We're on Twitch and we have a Discord server, so check out all of that and connect with us. We love meeting other homebrewers, homesteaders, and folks that are doing really the most projects like this. So until next time, from the Slytherin house, happy brewing, stay safe, and cheers. Scada-ba-be-da-bow, ba-da-ba-bow.